Well, it's the end of November and the gardening season is definitely slowing down here in Northern California, Zone 9B, at least in my garden. And it's time for me to put my garden beds to rest. One of my favorite ways to do that is by planting cover crops. Hi green lovers, it's Tara, and today I'm going to be talking to you about cover crops, why they're important, and why you should be planting them in your garden. And I'm going to show you how I am going to be planting cover crops in my garden. So stay tuned, coming right up. And if you like this video, if you learned something new, please do consider subscribing to my channel. It'll mean a lot to me. So when you put your garden beds to rest for the winter, typically you would amend them and cover them with something. And that something is usually a layer of mulch to protect it from the cold, prevent evaporation, keep that soil nice and warm. All of those things that you use mulch for would be a really good reason to put a nice thick layer of mulch over your garden beds for the winter. But there's another kind of mulch that you can use, a living mulch, and that's what cover crops are. So the first reason you might want to use cover crops is because you want to prevent weeds from growing in the winter. So nature typically does not like bare soil. If you have patches of bare soil, you'll often find weeds growing and rapidly growing in all of those bare spaces. It's just nature's way of protecting the soil and keeping the nutrition in the place that it should be for the next generation of plants. So that's what those weeds tend to do. They're actually nature's cover crop. But you want to be able to control what kind of cover crop is used because you want to bring in certain beneficial properties from the cover crops, which brings me to the second reason why you would want to use cover crops, because they add something back to the soil. So these are things like leguminous cover crops, where they actually have the nitrogen fixation properties in their root nodules, and they work with bacteria, rhizobium, to actually fix nitrogen in the roots. And what you want to do is wait for the plant to get to about flowering point, and then you want to break it down into the soil. That's when the nitrogen is strongest in those nodules. If you let it go to fruit, the plant will use the nitrogen that it has stored to create that fruit. So you want to make sure you get it before that. The third reason you want to use cover crops potentially is to prevent the soil as well as the nutrition in the soil, the nutrients in the soil, from running off due to rain and things like that. So cover crops like cereal rye and other cereal type of cover crops have these thick fibrous roots, and they tend to hold on to the soil, and they also tend to absorb the nutrients in the soil and store them in the plant. So that way you hold on to the nutrition, you keep the soil in place, just like nature would do in the forest. The fourth reason you want to use cover crops in your soil is because you want to build a variety of crops. You don't want monoculture, you want polyculture. That is really what is best for your soil because it helps maintain a good balance of nutrients in the soil. And it's almost like a mini rotation, crop rotation that you would do in the winter in preparation for spring. So a variety of cover crops is actually best. And the fifth, and probably the most important reason for me at least that I use cover crops, is because they add biomass to the soil. I'm trying to build my soil. My soil is very, very poor, and I'm trying to build it up as naturally as I possibly can. And cover crops make a great addition to the organic content of my soil. They bring in all kinds of nutrients. Cover crops typically have root systems that go fairly deep, and so they mine for minerals down in my wonderful clayey soil that is impenetrable to most of my annuals. Cover crops tend to be able to break through and bring up some of that nutrition and minerals, and that adds to my soil when I break the cover crops into the soil at the start of spring. So let's get into it. Let me show you how I plant cover crops in my garden. So I did it, folks. I finally killed off my entire backyard lawn, and I have covered it with wood chips. So this space that you see to my right has been wood chipped last year. So a little over a year ago, I completely covered up this grassy space with about 4 inches or so of wood chips, just like I did on this side this year. Wood chips have added a lot of organic material to the soil, but the problem with wood chips is that they take forever to decompose, and also they are fungally active. So the decomposition of wood chips and heavy carbon material is primarily a fungal process. So fungal activity in the soil is very, very high right now because of all of the wood chips in it. The problem though is I can't really plant anything in it because while wood chips are decomposing, they are tying up nitrogen in the soil temporarily while they decompose. They will release the nitrogen once they have completely decomposed, but until then, yeah, they're grabbing the nitrogen. So if I want to plant anything in here, I've got to dig a hole deep enough, put some good soil in it, and then plant in that. So I've gone ahead and made furrows in the space that I'm going to be planting my cover crops. And I noticed while I was doing that there was so much wood chips unbroken down as I dug through this. And now that is going to be absorbing quite a bit of nitrogen out of the soil. So in order to compensate for that, I'm going to put a thin layer of beet pulp, which is the byproduct of processing of sugar beets after the sugar has been extracted. That's made into pulp and it's used as animal feed. So I've got some over here, and I'm going to take that and I'm going to be layering it into those furrows. And this is an organic fertilizer which will slowly decompose and help out with the nitrogen loss associated with the decomposition of the wood chips. Now the cover crop that I'm going to be planting is bell beans. It's a legume, and legumes do tend to fix their own nitrogen, so I might not have anything to worry about, but all the same I'm going to be adding a nitrogen source just to help out with those wood chips, help them decompose a little faster. So here I've got my legumes, my cover crop legumes that have been soaking. I've got some garbanzo beans, I've got some bell beans, and I've got a green manure mix of different types of legumes. Now, legumes have a nitrogen fixing property, and they need a bacterium called rhizobium, which I'm going to inoculate them with in order to really be effective at the nitrogen fixing. Now, this bacteria is present in most soils. However, it is less in some and more in others, and I'm just not going to take a chance because I know that my soil does have a lot of wood chips in it, and that will be absorbing nitrogen, and I want to give these beans every chance they can to fix the most nitrogen possible to help with the decomposition of all of that organic material in the soil. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to add a tablespoon of this to each of these containers. I'm going to swirl it around, let it sit for about 15 minutes, and then I'm going to go out and plant. So here are my inoculated beans. This is kind of what it looks like with a tablespoon of that inoculant in it. And they're nicely soaked and plumped up quite nicely to about maybe double the size that they were originally. You can actually let these soak overnight. See, as you can see, these are still a little crinkly. But I'm going to go ahead. It was just about a couple of hours that I had them soaking. Good enough. My soil is nice and moist, and it should be good enough to get these things off their feet and running. So all I'm going to be doing here is, in this soil, in this furrow, I'm going to be burying these maybe about 1 inch deep or so, and I'm going to be placing them about 2 to 3 inches apart. That should be good enough to provide a nice thick cover. So that's about it. I want to make sure I don't bury it too deep. And it's as easy as that. So let me go ahead and finish this up, and then I'm going to show you a couple of final steps that I'm going to do to make these really, really take off. So I've planted up all the bell beans, and I have covered them with a layer of shredded leaves as mulch because I just don't like seeing ground exposed. So that will hopefully help retain some of the temperature in the soil as well. The days are getting colder, and it'll give the beans the warmth it needs to germinate. And I'm also going to add one additional thing. secret sauce. Coming up, shade cloth. I'm actually going to cover the entire space with a layer of shade cloth. Now this is 40% shade cloth, so it actually does let light through, but I will be coming every single day and checking on these, and as soon as I see a tiny little bean sprout coming up, I'm going to remove the shade cloth and maybe cover it with some tulle. And the reason I keep covering it with stuff is because I've got a ton of oak trees, beautiful oak trees in my property, and what that means is chipmunks. And while I am doing my gardening, I am sure there's plenty of them sitting there and watching me and saying, as soon as she is done, we're gonna come and we're gonna dig up what she has planted, all those goodies, and that it's gonna be a party, guys. So I am not taking any chances. I'm going to be covering it up with shade cloth, checking every few days, and opening up the shade cloth and covering it with tulle as soon as the beans start to sprout. So that's it, green lovers. I hope you learned how to plant cover crops, and I hope this video encourages you to go out and plant some of your own. I'm sitting here next to some garbanzo cover crops that I planted in this bed about maybe a month ago, and they're growing beautifully. And I'm hoping that the beds that I just planted are going to look like this or even better in the next few weeks. Thank you for watching. Hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. And until next time, live green and love your greens.